So one of the premier liars in Congress, boy, that's really saying something, George Santos, has been indicted and is facing federal charges. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm helping you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So the Department of Justice has indicted George Santos, and he will be facing federal criminal charges. There are 13 counts to the indictment, and the charges could hold up to 20 years of a prison sentence if he is convicted. Now, it's worth noting that this indictment, and even potentially the conviction, would not preclude him from serving in Congress. Although the Republican conference typically has a policy that if you are convicted of a felony, then you should resign. Santos, though, for his part, has claimed that he is not resigning, and in fact, he said he's running for re-election, which that'll be interesting to watch. But it makes you wonder just what are the charges that Santos is facing. Well, as it turns out, we have the indictment, and I'm going to post a link to it down below. But there are a few things I want to highlight about this indictment. Even though there are 13 charges that are being brought against Santos, really they arise from 3 acts on his part. First, it's alleged that there's a company called Redstone Strategies, a Florida company, that supposedly did political fundraising work for Santos. Now, in a quirk of American law, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, certain organizations, which are called 501c4 nonprofit organizations, can engage in independent expenditures in political campaigns without limit. So they can take in contributions from people in support of a campaign and then spend it to support that candidacy. Frequently when you see the attack ads that are being sponsored by somebody like Americans Against Corrupt Leadership, that's typically being done by some 501c4 supported by billionaires, typically. One of the requirements, though, for something to be an independent expenditure, though, is that they don't coordinate their expenditures with the campaign. Now, that can be very hard to prove, frankly. And I can tell you that there's a lot of probably kind of a wink and a nod that goes on between the political campaign itself and various independent committees that are supporting the campaign of a certain candidate. But officially, there's not supposed to be any crossover. Well, in most cases, if the funds had been spent on some type of political campaign activity, then I have to say this would be a very weak charge indeed. But instead what happened is the funds that were brought in to this company after representations were made to several people that this was a 501c4 and that the contributions to this organization were going to go to television advertising in support of Santos's candidacy. Well, it turns out that those representations, which were made supposedly by a political operative at Santos's direction, well, it turns out that they were false. Number one, this was not a 501c4. You need to go through a process to register such an organization with the IRS. When you hear 501c3 or 501c4, what they're referring to is essentially a section in the Internal Revenue Code. So a 501c4 organization is an organization that has been designated as such pursuant to the guidelines in section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code. Say for 501c3 and, for that matter, 401k, for example. That's where those terms come from. So there are a couple of issues here. The number one is that these were clearly fraudulent misrepresentations. They were being made to somebody to try to accomplish something. They were untruthful at the time they were made. They knew they were untruthful, and they were being made to essentially get money out of somebody. That's fraud. Now, the biggest issue that the Department of Justice would have here is proving that this was actually George Santos who did it when it was actually his campaign staffer who actually engaged in the fraud. They'll have to show that he directed it. Unfortunately for Santos, that's not the end of the story. Those funds were then taken from this company, put into his personal bank account, and used to purchase clothing. Indeed, the indictment makes it quite clear that it was designer clothing. They didn't go to Walmart to buy this stuff. So the illegal activity that they're claiming occurred here is, number one, fraud was committed to try to raise these funds at George Santos's direction, and then these funds were used personally by George Santos. So, number one, they were fraudulently obtained, by telling people that this was a 501c4 and that it was going to be used for Santos's campaign. And number two, then, they were taken by Santos personally, showing that this was not an independent expenditure. Going back to that other question I was talking about earlier, where these independent committees have to at least theoretically operate independently. You know, if these funds were given, say, to Santos's political campaign, and then he used them for clothing, well, he could argue that, you know, he needed to be well-dressed for his campaign appearances, and that he essentially used those funds for clothing so that other funds were available for TV. I mean, it gets to be a big mess. But here, there's clearly a problem that he's got in that the funds were given to the committee, or to the business, not the committee, and then transferred to George Santos personally, showing that there was illegal coordination going on there. So that's the first illegal activity that's being addressed here. The second one has to do with illegal financial disclosures that were made. One of the requirements of any member of Congress is that you need to disclose your income and your wealth to Congress. There are certain forms that need to be filled out, and they need to be signed under penalty of perjury. Well, allegedly, Santos submitted one financial disclosure form that did not detail the income he was getting from this company that was supposedly raising money for his candidacy, but really was just funneling money into his pocket. So then what Santos did is he amended his disclosure statements, once that became public, and instead claimed to have had income of $750,000 a year, which he clearly did not have. And it seems odd that he could get in trouble for bragging about getting more money than he got. Usually financial disclosures tend to try to show that you don't have as much money as you do have. When in George Santos's case, he was trying to claim that he had more money than he did. It seems very odd, but just really goes to the pathology of this guy, who's clearly a pathological liar. So the fact that these disclosures were submitted that he at a time that he knew they were false is perjury, and he's being charged with that. So that's the second big criminal activity that he's charged with. Now, the third one, and ironically, I actually think this is the strongest case against him, has to do with illegally accepting unemployment benefits. Allegedly, after the CARES Act passed, which gave the expanded unemployment benefits to people during the COVID crisis, Santos applied for and received almost $25,000 in unemployment benefits. Now, what's wrong with that, you say? The problem was he was working at the time. He was earning an income from a job earning $120,000 a year. Now, setting aside the fact that this company he was working for at the time has now been shut down because of the fact that it appears it was a Ponzi scheme, the one thing that is not in dispute is he was receiving income from this business at the same time as he was claiming to be unemployed and therefore entitled to nearly $25,000 in unemployment compensation. That, to me, is a slam dunk case. And I can say that because I actually have defended people who were accused of unlawfully receiving unemployment benefits in excess of what they were entitled to. Generally speaking, it was some mistake where they continued to receive it for a time period after they'd gotten a job, when they had been unemployed for a period. But whenever that happened, the people had to pay back those benefits plus damages, typically 3 times the total amount that they received, plus interest. So this is not something that's a laughing matter. And even though it seems fairly mundane, this could actually be the big one that brings down Santos. Now, aside from all this, we have to remember that Brazilian authorities also want to charge him with crimes, because what he did there is he basically stole someone's checkbook, allegedly, and then fraudulently wrote checks to purchase clothing at a store in Brazil. Now, the Brazilian authorities had pretty much given up on trying to prosecute him for this because they couldn't find him. Well, guess what? All the attention that he's brought upon himself with this candidacy and his incessant lying has allowed the Brazilians to realize where he is. And my guess is they will be moving forward on charges against him. And in fact, there's an indication that they're holding a hearing on that in the near future. It'll be interesting to see if they look to extradite Santos once he's dealt with his charges here in the United States. Well, if you want to see more about the wholesale lying of George Santos, check out this video over here that I did a little while ago. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.